I'm glad that Harvey Smith, Warren Spector, and Alexander Brandon can be good sports about this game. Their blunt honesty about the failings of the follow-up to the critically acclaimed 2000 hit, from poor framework to barren musical soundscapes, paying too much attention to early game focus testers, diverging from the original's heavy RPG elements, to even the far more professional voice acting, is an excellent step from which to jump into discussing what makes this such an unusual and unfortunate video game. In June 2000, Ion Storm would release what is widely considered to be one of the best video games of all time. A PS2 port 2 years later would solidify its place in gaming culture as one of intense brilliance and introspection. A game about a dystopian cyberpunk world ravaged by plague and overrun with power-hungry agencies vying for control. It's not a particularly pretty game by any metric, and the voice acting was a touch on the unfortunate side. But what it lacks in visual gratuity and sensible accents, it more than makes up for in sharp, prescient writing, outstanding level design, and one of the best soundtracks in gaming history, according to me, at least. 3.5 years later, a sequel was released to much less fanfare. Reception, while still relatively high, was muted. Criticism was directed at the music, the AI, and the decision to create the game for console first that resulted in a poor PC port. Although the game did outsell its predecessor, its legacy is tarnished by its design decisions, technical issues, and the absence of character that made Deus Ex so memorable. Although efforts were made to revitalise the series for a third instalment, Ion Storm would eventually stumble into bankruptcy, and in 2005 they shuttered their doors for good. This is Invisible War. Set 20 years after the events of the original game, Invisible War is canonically a follow-on from a combination of all three of the original game's endings. JC Denton kills Bob Page and merges with Helios, catalyses the destruction of global communications, and joins the Illuminati to begin rebuilding the world. The result of this is that JC is known as the lunatic who caused the collapse, an economic crash and period of war that destabilised the global order, and caused cities to hurriedly wall in their civilians in an attempt to monitor and control population density. Two equally sinister factions emerged in the wake of the disaster: the World Trade Organization, or WTO, which is largely responsible for infrastructure guidance and/or control, and the creatively named Order, a religious organization birthed from a merger of multiple global faiths who are opposed to the strict policies of the WTO. In reality, both organisations are merely fronts for the Illuminati, puppeteered by returning characters Nicolette Duclair and Chad Dumier. Two other major factions vie for control of the player character: the Knights Templar, a vicious and militant organisation violently opposed to any kind of augmentation, or as it's known in this game, biomod usage, and the Omar, a heavily cybernetically enhanced species operating within a hive mind. The player controls Alex Denton, whose appearance is determined from a selection of 6 images, a clone of JC Denton and a member of the Tarsus Academy. Initially unbeknownst to Alex and their companions, the Academy is designed to perfect the modification of their genetic code in order to give JC the final pieces of a long-awaited puzzle needed to unify the world under Helios. Alongside Alex are 3 other trainees: Leo Jankowski, a hothead and high-ranking individual; Clara Sparks, a compassionate and apparently misplaced person; and Billy Adams, Alex's childhood friend who is absolutely definitely not a huge traitor. Alex finds themselves drawn into the webs of innumerable factions, desperate to use their unique nature to propagate their own societal ideal, and Alex is free to move between the various organisations at will, up to and including the game's finale. Invisible War is a considerably shorter game than its predecessor, with much of the heavier RPG elements stripped away to accommodate for the more mainstream audience that was being targeted. To manage expectations for the console architecture that the game was being built for, specifically the Xbox, as it was never released on the PS2. Areas are far smaller and more linear than the previous game, with numerous loading screens required to maintain a consistent performance from area to area, not that this works most of the time. In a fascinatingly bizarre move, the game's PC version closes and reopens itself to load the next area each time you transition through a loading screen, meaning that a huge chunk of my footage looks like this. The decision to have the game load this way on the PC results in some truly catastrophic technical problems, with corrupted save files resulting from the attempted loading flat out failing, to the game simply shitting itself and crashing, to one particularly fun event where I had to replay the entire opening section of Mako Ballistics because the game bugged out, showered me with a stack of 8 multi-tools, then crashed when I was walking through one of the loading screens that also updates your save file, resulting in a corrupted save that caused the game to crash over and over until I reloaded an older file. Alongside the crippling level design is the clear evidence that this is an FPS developed for a console when attempting to aim at literally anything other than the blank space next to an enemy. The hit detection is wildly inaccurate, with multiple instances of firing shots that definitely look like they should have hit but receiving no feedback from the enemy, shotgun blasts to the face phasing straight through them, and jerky, untenable mouse control that makes it extremely difficult to pull off any degree of precision. There is auto-aim capability in the options menu, but all that does is make it even more obvious that the game was never designed for the precise movement of a mouse. But let's pause for a minute before I get too weighed down in the structure and architecture of the game and go over the finer, better points of Invisible War. Although it is absolutely a product of its time, and those wide-eyed plastic faces definitely show their age in the dawn of early modern 3D gaming, it was considered a good-looking game for 2003 and certainly looks on a very surface level better than its predecessor. The physics engine is greatly upgraded, with bodies flinging themselves violently around if you hit them with an explosion, and every piece of furniture not nailed to the floor will be unceremoniously flung away from you if you so much as brush your big toe against them. Improvements made to the game's sound design allow for a finer degree of control over binaural panning, meaning you can often pinpoint enemy locations based on sound direction, when it feels like working or making sense. When the music is present, it's more often than not the excellent blend of synths and orchestra that made the original so memorable. It's just a shame there isn't more of it, and by the sound of it, original series composer Alexander Brandon agrees. Unlike the first game, which featured a basic phasing element to its composition to allow for the music to dynamically alter depending on the player's actions, Invisible War's soundtrack is far more muted and downplayed, very rarely surging the way the originals did. Despite that, there are a few standout tracks that are worth listening to, if only to be disappointed that they don't last longer. Beyond that, the voice acting is somewhat of an improvement, even if it frequently sounds like the actors had zero context for their lines. It was considered to be leagues ahead of its predecessor, even if I disagree and think the original had far more charm. Alex themselves is voiced by contemporary VA legend Laura Bailey, or Dragon Ball and all-round anime dub veteran Christopher Sabat. And having played as both those voice actors, I can say with absolute certainty that this is a role that no one could have done much justice to. Alex isn't terribly well written, their inflection is all over the place, their motivations are lackluster as a result of being able to swing aimlessly back and forth between factions due to the way the game is built. It's difficult to voice Alex in a consistent way purely because of the varying elements of the game, but for the material they had to hand, both actors do as best a job as they possibly could. Aside from the two big names in place, returning characters JC and Paul Denton are still voiced by J. Anthony Frank. Nicolette Duclair's voice actress Ellen Losey returns, despite the fact that she sounds almost completely different, something that threw me so much I genuinely thought it was someone else. Prolific anime VA Tiffany Grant plays Clara Sparks, one of the other trainees, with considerably more consistency than the main character. And similarly prolific VA Jason Douglas does his absolute best attempt at an Australian accent?
Well, an Enclave kid comes down to cruise the slums on Daddy's credit line. First time at sea level?
My parents are dead. They were in Chicago at the time of the attack.
Oh, sorry mate, just talking chaff, no offense.
I think it's supposed to be Australian, either that or he got lost somewhere between Paul Hogan and Dick Van Dyke. Given the original game's pedigree and considering the game had roughly the population of Centralia, Pennsylvania to voice its hundreds of characters, Invisible War has a decently diverse cast. Although it has a much smaller scope, with far fewer people who really need individual personalities, so take that however you will. Aspects of the plot can be genuinely fun to unravel, and the game continues in the trend of having reactionary dialogue that adjusts based on your previous actions. For example, in the early game you can nosily poke around in an apartment building to find information on one of the Tarsus Academy mentors, Layla Nassif. If you choose to go there before speaking to the WTO, their dialogue will adapt to berate you for not going to see them first, but they will then continue on and ask you to investigate something else while you're there. This happens throughout the game, with it being possible to find and complete side missions without ever speaking to the person who's supposed to give them, then finding them later and completing the quest with a brief, "Oh yeah, I did that ages ago," for no particular reason. This is something that carries over to the actual gameplay itself, with many objectives having multiple ways to complete them. An excellent early game example is a series of conflicting objectives that stem from Club Vox. You can be asked by a politician within the air terminal to find proof of the owner's corruption for a reward. While you're there, you can also talk to the owner of the club, who will ask you to assassinate a businessman, and in turn that businessman, if you do choose to talk to him, will instead tell you to kill an Omar trader who is hiding in the VIP section of the club. The Omar himself also has a quest that involves breaking into the club's basement to grab a tissue sample from an alien if you so desire, which you can complete before deciding what to do about the overall side quest. You're free to kill whomsoever you please in as straightforward a manner as you like, as well as find the proof of the corruption that the politician wants. Or you can have a cheeky conversation with an AI called NG Resonance, a charming little feature that essentially functions as the eyes and ears of the WTO within multiple major establishments, whilst hiding under a veneer of just being a digital facade of a real in-universe pop star. You can tell NG that there is a trader hiding out in the VIP section conducting illegal activity, which she will forward to the WTO, resulting in a raid on the club that kills the Omar. You can then go back to the businessman in the Emerald Suites for a reward, and he will congratulate your unique method of murder, as well as still turn in the evidence of corruption from the club to the air terminal chap for even more money. All of this is also entirely optional. I missed this on my first run through the game because I never went to the club and never spoke to the politician. It's a fun touch that a lot of games are severely lacking even nowadays, and it makes the world feel just a touch more immersive. And in this game, every little piece of immersion you can scrape from it really matters. As I'm hoping the last 1,000-ish words have demonstrated, Invisible War is not devoid of any merit. In fact, there is a lot to enjoy about this game. Despite the fact that much of it is stripped down and its technical performance is rocky at best, it still features some great writing and quest design. It plays fairly well as long as you're not trying to shoot anything, and it does have some interesting locations. The problem is that it's deeply inconsistent, and especially when playing on PC, there are a litany of issues that compound on one another. Some entirely down to personal preference, others that strip away some of the best parts of the original game in the name of streamlining for a mainstream audience. So let's take a look at the biggest problems that Invisible War has. If, heaven forbid, you're anything like me, one of the first things you will probably notice is that the HUD is absolutely enormous. Where the original had a reasonably streamlined HUD that kept itself to the far edges of the screen, Invisible War instead features a GoldenEye-style circular HUD. Except unlike GoldenEye, where the HUD only appears when you take damage, this one is here constantly. There is no option to rescale it, although poking around on various forums suggests that this is more an issue with custom scaling, though I don't really see what's custom about an aspect ratio that is included in the base game, so I presume it's more just the fact that the game has poor visual balancing. The HUD takes up an unreasonable amount of space, and if someone decides to call you, which will happen an ungodly amount, then a good 2/3 of the screen are taken up by the HUD. The only real blessing is that it's semi-transparent, but this could have been easily resolved by just importing the HUD from the original or just having it fade away when it's not in use. Unfortunately, this is not something that could really be done. The problem with the consolification of the game is that much of what made up the heavier RPG elements of Deus Ex have been removed from Invisible War. Skills such as hacking terminals, mastery of various weapons, and so on have been removed entirely, with hacking being relegated to a black market biomod instead. The targeted health display that allowed for damage to be distributed across various limbs with different effects based on where you've been hit previously has also been removed. Possibly because it was too complicated for a console to cope with, as I believe it was also removed from the PS2 version of the first game. You can now only have 6 augmentations or biomods at a time, although unlike the original they can be swapped out at will as long as you have the correct type of biomod canister. Speaking of which, the canisters themselves no longer relate to one specific type of augmentation, but instead can be used to give access to any biomod unless it is specifically a black market biomod. which the computer hacking augmentation is, which means you cannot get access to computer hacking at the very start of the game. You have to find a black market biomod canister before you can do so. The big issue with this for me personally is that the biomod slot that allows for hacking is the same one that also allows you to cloak, forcing you to choose between a basic skill from the original game and magical invisibility. And believe me, by the final quarter of Invisible War, when there was apparently an RPG launcher sale at the local gun market, you will want to be able to cloak. This is a very odd limitation, and I struggle to believe that they couldn't have just lessened the number of skills you had instead of outright removing them, and just allow you to complement your augmentations with a select number of skills instead, even if it was just hacking, gun mastery and lockpicking. As it stands, multi-tools now pull double duty for unlocking keypads and lock containers with the exact same magical animation for both. You cannot access a terminal unless you have specifically found the login details for it or can hack it, and you cannot use a keypad unless you have specifically found the code for it or use a multi-tool. So even in the PC version, no more using that noggin of yours to remember a code from a previous run and unlock a door you otherwise wouldn't have access to. And don't get me wrong, I understand why it makes sense to not let you use a keypad if you don't know the code, but being able to access areas throughout the game on a second run that you worked for in the last one feels like a good reward. It negates the tedium of repeat playthroughs. For example, in the first The Last of Us, you have to find the safe code to unlock a safe. You can't manually enter it even on repeat playthroughs. But in the sequel, you can brute force a safe by just listening to it, or if you already know the code, you can manually enter it without having Ellie poke around someone's bedroom again. Simple streamlining of things like this encourage repeat playthroughs by giving you access to things you already know about without forcing you to go through all of the tedium of having to find it again. This is one of those things that is very much personal preference, but for me, I love feeling rewarded for randomly remembering the code for this one extremely specific door, and getting access to supplies I otherwise wouldn't have been able to reach. And at the same time, giving you the option to input the code manually doesn't mean you're forced to do it. You can still go out there and explore to find the code every time if you want to. It's just one of those little things that makes playing a video game feel less cumbersome when you're looking to have fun, or you're on the clock. On the topic of the HUD and its simplification, the inventory has also been overhauled. Rather than a Resident Evil 4 attaché case before Resi 4 ever existed, it's more akin to Resident Evil 5's slot-based inventory, where an egg takes up the same amount of space as a rocket launcher. This is absolutely a subjective thing, but I will say for me personally, I miss the inventory Tetris that came with trying to cram a Gep gun in between a crowbar, a dragon-tooth sword and 15 chocolate bars. On the plus side, items do now appropriately stack, as foodstuffs will stack together instead of taking up one spot per nibble. The only minor issue with this is that the number of items that will stack varies depending on what the item is, and whether or not that's an issue is, again, personal preference. For example, you can carry around 30 food items in one stack, but only 10 multi-tools at a time. It's a little strange that a rocket launcher takes up the same amount of pocket dimension space as 30 packets of crisps, but I can take or leave this. And continuing with the theme of simplification, very much like Mass Effect 2 many years later, the game's guns now have universal ammo. There is one ammo type for every gun in the game, with the limitation being that the more damage a gun does, the more of that universal ammo it uses. The ammo counter, however, is not number-based. Instead, it's a blue bar with a series of additional spines over here, and it depletes in chunks based on what weapon you're using. This can be a little jarring and confusing, especially given that it's quite difficult to really determine at a glance just how much of your ammo you're actually using. But the upside is that ammo no longer takes up space in your inventory. You're just limited on how much you can actually carry, so it's not possible to be hugely encumbered with pockets full of clips. The problem with this, especially towards the end of the game, is that the lack of differentiation between weapon ammo makes the final quarter of Invisible War extremely frustrating in places. When everyone starts pulling rocket launchers out their arses and enemies are largely groups of mechs with only a few squishy humans. With how compressed many of the areas are, this section of Cairo's arcology area being especially egregious for this issue. This can result in you struggling to get away from their rockets whilst you desperately try to thin the huge crowds of enemies with your own. And if you run out of ammo, you will have to sprint past and pray. Combined with the hit detection issues I've already highlighted, you will likely find yourself sliding in and out of cover from behind a corner or a wall, firing a rocket here and there and hoping it hits them, and then sliding back in again, repeating the process. The blessing is that there is a damage buff on unaware enemies, so it's possible to take the mechs out with 2 hits as long as they haven't seen you. But with how much ammo an RPG uses, and with how many mechs appear in the late game, this can be an exercise in absolute tedium more than it is one of proper positioning and resource management. EMPs or other types of grenades can be used as well, but they bounce around like crazy and have the same hit detection issues as bullets, so it's not a guaranteed success. This honestly could have been very easily resolved by taking that same Mass Effect 2 route of splitting universal ammo into two categories, heavy ammo and everything else. Just have two types of ammo depending on the gun you're using, meaning you're not wasting rockets on basic enemies and you're not wasting pistol ammo on enemies made of compressed car parts. Also, the fact that the bolt caster and the RPG use the same type of ammo is just baffling to me. It fires bolts, for God's sake. Why is it eating up my rocket launcher pistol shotgun ammo? Deviating from the discussion on overly simplifying the gameplay for a time, let's focus on one of the most heavily criticised aspects of Invisible War, the AI. Because dear God, the AI in this game is impressively bad. That's not to say that the original game's AI was particularly great, but it's worth remembering that Invisible War was 3 years later, during a period of huge progress within the gaming industry, as consoles began to dominate the market and developers suddenly realised that they could throw any old tosh onto the PS2 and it would sell in huge quantities. Regardless, the problem with Invisible War's AI is that it is not even remotely improved upon the original game, and in fact, as a result of how compressed and linear the game is, it actually feels worse. The AI has no ability to hide how awful it is by virtue of the fact that it doesn't have any space to run away or hide the way that the original game's enemies could. Enemies will blindly stand before you, eating your bullets without reacting or spinning in circles like complete lunatics. They will throw grenades at walls and act surprised when it bounces back and explodes in their face. They will get distracted by corpses when they already know you're there and should realistically be shooting at you already.
Give me a shot, mercenaries.
Another casualty.
They will stand behind doors and clip through them whilst attempting to shoot them, which sometimes results in you being shot at some very interesting angles. And this ridiculous behaviour isn't even limited to enemy AI. In the playthrough that I recorded for this video, I watched Sid Black, one of the helicopter pilots you can hire in the game, you know, the Australian one, die a completely preventable death because he apparently didn't realise that he could just walk out of the gas cloud that was killing him. The unfortunate AI persists with other friendly NPCs as well. In the original game, after climbing up to the NSF commander's hideaway in the Statue of Liberty, you would be followed shortly after by UNATCO soldiers, who state that they cut through them like a hot knife through butter. True to their word, even if you killed absolutely no one, every enemy will be dead on your return journey to the UNATCO base. In Invisible War, there is a quote-unquote secret base that you must break into to rescue Her Holiness in Trier, Germany. Once you rescue Nicolette and Donna Morgan, the WTO agent who's there as well, you'll be greeted by a heavily augmented Illuminati agent who claims that they will handle the cleanup and you should leave. Except if you walk back through the area, any enemies that you left alive will still be there fighting the soldiers who have followed you in. And while it's nice to see them duking it out, there's the slight issue of the utterly idiotic AI being like this, to be honest. This is hardly a new complaint. It was the most common criticism of the game even at the time of release, but it's very much worth pointing out that the AI is a much bigger issue when the game starts throwing RPG mechs at you in the late game. A perfect instance of this happened in the Antarctica section, where I got fed up with playing peekaboo with the enemies and sprinted away to this little building here, closing the door behind me. Whereupon the conga line that I'd attracted crammed themselves into the door frame, desperately trying to get to me while simultaneously shouting that I couldn't possibly have gone far. No matter how long I stood out of sight, crouched or otherwise, they would not go away. I ended up jumping out of a vent in the roof since they would have politely slaughtered me if I had actually opened the door to leave. Since we're on the subject of NPCs, we may as well talk about the surrounding cast of characters and segue into discussing the writing. I've already mentioned that the voice acting is generally far better than in the original game, with several actors returning to voice their original characters, as well as a fair few relatively big names in the voiceover scene. And that definitely serves the game quite well for the most part. But there is something about Invisible War's writing that makes it a notable step down from its predecessors, something that Harvey Smith himself discusses in that quote that I opened the video with. It's not a great story, and the reason, I think, is because it is so heavily compressed. This is a much smaller, shorter game compared to the original. Its areas are restricted by the RAM limitations of the Xbox, which the team chose to develop the game for in its initial stages, meaning that they were forced to make the areas far smaller and more linear. Coupled with the ability to shift allegiances throughout the game, the writing naturally suffers from having to both accommodate for a more compressed experience and a more open story. I'm sorry I keep saying the word compressed, but it is the only word that I can think to explain how this game feels to play. I know that sounds a little odd, but let me give a few examples. The opening of the game is particularly notable for just how often you are bothered by calls from the WTO and the Order, as they both desperately vie for your attention, shouting orders at you from afar with little regard for the actual allegiances that you've shown. It's only once you reach Cairo that there's any real visible impact on the choices you've made so far, where the group that you've spurned up to that point will send a few people after you to commit extremely badly planned assassinations. But once you kill them, the group responsible hand waves the attack away, wags an angry finger and tells you not to upset them again, and then they never do anything like that throughout the rest of the game, unless I just missed it. The problem with this is that whilst you can drift from group to group, there's never any real sense that you're upsetting people or causing problems for the other group, because the game needs you to be able to swap allegiances as and when you deign it fit. This means it never commits to anything concrete and never really challenges your decisions right up until the end of the game when the final choice is made. And whilst it can be considered a good thing that you're not forced down one strict path the way you were in the original game, the result is a wishy-washy story that, whilst reactive on some levels, like the previously discussed side quests that play out quite well, the overarching story has to be able to keep pushing forward no matter what you've done, and that story does not change until the very final cutscene. In the midst of all this, the writing really struggles to commit to a particular tone. The way that Deus Ex would have the characters call you up to speculate over the existence of entities like the Illuminati, such as when Tracer Tong calls you to talk about Adam Weishaupt and is later admonished by JC for taking the piss, was always done with a consistent "this is weird but entirely plausible" tone, which meant that characters could adapt to situations as they evolved. Uncovering the Illuminati and finding Lucius de Beer's artificially maintained body, for example, is a fascinating moment that allows the player to demoralise Morgan Everett by undermining the authority he believes he has, by killing Lucius. It doesn't have any effect on the ending of the game, don't get me wrong, and indeed Deus Ex gives you the option to commit to any of the three endings throughout most of the final level. But the difference is that the writing doesn't feel like it's having to accommodate for an entirely different audience. Deus Ex very much feels like a game written for adults, a game meant to play into the fears of the unknown, hidden authorities, the terrifying probability that most major corporations are guided by one invisible hand. Invisible War often feels like it was written for children, and there is no greater evidence of that than this scene.
I could tell them myself. They would think it was the same old story. The Illuminati secretly controlling the world. Who? Some might believe it, but everybody else would laugh in my face.
I don't know, maybe it's just me, but there's something extremely childish about Chad Dumier here saying the words "ooh, scary" about his literal underground world-controlling society. It's just a little too on the nose for a game whose predecessor weaved so many threads created from real-world organisations, drawn from real-world fears, and explored in a way that allowed JC Denton to remain sceptical, even whilst being drawn into increasingly dark and twisted rabbit holes. Invisible War struggles to make Alex comparable because they rarely come across as particularly motivated or even interested in the political machinations going on around them. Alex never seems to be bothered by the fact that the majority of the game is spent listening to two specific people shouting orders at them. They never get angry that they're just being used, they never really commit to or connect to any of the tenuous threads I'd hesitate to call friends, even when the player makes the conscious choice to help someone out. Whenever someone asks them to do something, no matter how antithetical it is to something else that they have literally just done, they will accept it and say "sure, why not?" or "sure, I'll think about it." I'm not even sure that you can flat out refuse to do something most of the time. You just ignore the goal until it goes away when you leave the area. And again, this is a result of the game allowing you to change allegiances on a whim. Alex needs to be able to believably move from one organisation to the other. But the result of this is that they have no personality and no motivation. As a result of the poor characterization, it makes it extremely difficult to sympathise with any of the characters who provide you with an ending, as they're all either poorly explained or sound unintentionally, if comically, evil. This is especially noticeable when you're in Antarctica and you can find a Templar who is trapped in a cage and asks you to let him out. When you discuss his extreme views, he says to each their own, I won't attack you, we're not all that bad. And if you then proceed to let him out, he briefly has a neutral blue targeting reticule over him before suddenly saying, wait a minute, you're a stinking dirty biomod, whereupon he immediately attacks you. After watching you burst through the rest of the area and slaughter everything in your path like an absolute fucking idiot. I don't know if this happens every time or if his reaction changes depending on something else, some other factor that I never understood. But it happened both times I played the game for this video, and it strikes me as accidentally stupid given that 5 minutes later, the Templar leader Saman contacts you to try to breed sympathy to his cause. It's impressively bad writing. And whilst I'm on one, why is Alex such a massive bitch to Ava, the other helicopter pilot? This womanly AI is giving you free rides everywhere around the globe, and Alex just can't help but be a passive-aggressive jerk to her. I know this is a serious nitpick, but it's just one of those things that struck me as incredibly bizarre. Although to be fair, this is also a character who has zero reaction to seeing aliens littered about the place and isn't even remotely fazed when they start chattering away to them as if they're old friends, so maybe I shouldn't be thinking about it too much. It's unfortunate that so much of this game is hampered by the technology the team chose to work with, but it is also important to stress that the team chose this. They decided to make the game for consoles first, and whilst it's understandable that they would want to bring Deus Ex to a wider market, it was a game that defined a generation with its complexity and extraordinary scope. And that scope was the biggest victim of the choice to build the game around the inferior Xbox architecture. Invisible War's most prominent issue is just how short and lacking in environments, intricate or even faintly interesting level design it is. And it just has a general absence of the rich tapestry of locations and side areas that made up its predecessor. There are just 3 major locations in Invisible War: Chicago, Cairo and Trier, with Liberty Island and Antarctica being minor areas with no additional content. Both of the latter 2 are extremely small, with no real reason to explore beyond completing the primary objectives. There is a good amount of side content in Chicago and a fair few interesting quests in Cairo, but it really feels as though Chicago is the only area in the game that is adequately fleshed out. There are an abundance of side quests, places to see, people to talk to, with an excellent variation in how you can approach and complete multiple quests. You can complete all of the major objectives without ever speaking to the WTO or the Order representatives, although this won't stop them from badgering you for the rest of the game. By contrast, Trier is such an unmemorable location that I completely forgot it existed in between playthroughs. Further compounding the issue of minimal locations and restrictive design is the fact that the game is absolutely packed with loading screens, especially in the late game and especially in Cairo. There are areas that require you to transition through 3 to 5 loading screens just to get to the one NPC you need to speak to in order to progress the story. As I discussed way back at the start, Invisible War also loads by closing the entire game and then reopening it. It is one of the strangest methods of loading that I have ever seen, and I've never come across any other game that operates in this way. If you have, let me know. I'm curious to see if there are any other games that function like this. Regardless, this is a persistent issue throughout the game, and unlike the vast areas that could be freely explored within the original, the Xbox limitations forced the team to make far smaller areas with more interactable objects, movable items, and the physics engine, for example. According to reviews from the time, the game ran surprisingly well on the console, with the exception of some frame rate issues, but as far as the PC version is concerned, it is severely hampered by being a port that was an unfortunate product of its time, instead of a superior version not constrained by home console limitations. That restriction makes the game feel rushed, especially as it ramps up to its finale. The ending of Deus Ex is a complex and intricately designed affair, with each possible ending requiring multiple steps to be followed, as well as providing a wealth of additional information that continues to enrich the world right up until its final moments. By contrast, Invisible War's conclusion can be reached within 5 minutes of arriving at the island. All that you're required to do to complete the game is to enter the old UNATCO ruins, download a file, choose who to send it to, then return to them. You may or may not be made to kill JC, depending on who you pick, but that only adds another 1 to 2 minutes to the ending. And following that, you'll be greeted with the final cutscene that you have earned. The only exception to this is the Scorched Earth ending, which requires you to kill every major faction leader to trigger it. It massively dampens your efforts up to this point, particularly if you've been playing all sides. You can weave your way around all of the bastarding rocket launcher enemies as long as you remember to neck bags of crisps and chocolate bars when you inevitably take a few rockets to the face, and then leg it back to JC to finish the game. Weirdly, and this is quite possibly the single most nitpicky nitpick I will ever make, so forgive the stupidity of this statement, but when you finish the game, it doesn't even play the credits. Instead, you are very unceremoniously booted back to the title screen immediately after the cutscene ends. Like I said, I know this is a deeply silly thing to complain about, although in my defense it's less a complaint and more an observation. But it's just so bloody abrupt that it really threw me both times it happened. It's almost as if the game is embarrassed to still be taking up your time and wants to shuffle you out the room as fast as possible. So, what went wrong? It was made for a console. That is what went wrong with this game. It's unfortunate, and I should strongly stress that I love console gaming just as much as PC gaming, but in the early 2000s, as the PS2 proved that gaming was not just some pathetic nerdy hobby, the resultant explosion meant that the relatively niche genre of complex and methodical PC game development was in a rush to sell to a brand new audience, one restricted by the heavy limitations of their hardware. Being forced to build something as intricate as Deus Ex into the PC architectural equivalent of a rusty toaster was just not possible, and the result was that many major players in the computer game space were dumbed down, losing their wit, charm, and character. Deus Ex was not the first Eidos property to suffer from this. Thief Deadly Shadows was notoriously restrictive compared to its predecessors as a result of being designed for a console first, and making no effort to resolve its issues for the PC version. In their haste to capitalise on an exponentially growing market, the inevitable corporate greed meant that PC gaming was left in the dust for a long while, partly due to the increasing cost of computing power as games leapt forward into increasing strides of technological advancement. Prior to getting myself a gaming PC in 2015, the last game I was able to play on my family's home computer and my own personal laptop was Fahrenheit. The beauty of console gaming was that developers didn't have to spend time trying to accommodate for the huge variations in technology within computers. Laziness maybe, but time is money, and consoles had far surpassed PCs so quickly that from a business point of view it made sense to abandon complexity for safety, no matter how much I may hate that fact. Although it's seen its resurgence in recent years, it is undeniable that the console market had a hugely detrimental effect on the viability and marketability of PC gaming, and that in turn led to the memification of the PC gaming master race that we all know and love today. When the first teaser trailer for Human Revolution was released, I was absolutely ecstatic. I'd not played Invisible War at that point, partly because I didn't have an Xbox or a PC that could run it, and partly because by then I'd heard it wasn't as good as the first game and I didn't really want to be disappointed. And whilst I have a few issues with Human Revolution, it feels far more like the game that Harvey Smith would have wanted to make, were he not limited by the architecture of the Xbox. Don't get me wrong, Human Revolution is a great game, although it does still suffer from a few pitfalls of its own, but many of those were also well ironed out in the director's cut sometime later, most notably the hideous golden glow that obscured every inch of the screen in the original release. Lessons were certainly learned, it's just a shame that it took the demise of Ion Storm to learn them. For all my irritation at the worst parts of this game, I do think Harvey Smith was a little unfair on himself. So much of success within the early 2000s gaming industry hinged upon being able to corner the console market. And whilst Ion Storm made a valiant effort, it was a platform they were not used to, in a market they weren't part of, with a game that should never have been stapled to the Xbox. That said, the game was still considered a modest success, and surprisingly it did actually outsell the original, although this is very likely just due to it being released on a console as well. For all its faults, the Deus Ex legacy remains strong throughout the years, with a determined and dedicated fanbase who still await the end of the Adam Jensen trilogy despite the issues that Mankind Divided had. It's honestly a shame that the legacy of this series is as sullied by Invisible War as it seems to be, because I genuinely don't think it's that bad. If it weren't for the technical issues that weigh the game down, And perhaps if the developers had given the writing more than a cursory spell check, Invisible War would be far more enjoyable than it ended up being. Still, if you're curious, I would cautiously recommend it, and if you don't mind not experiencing the game in its purest form, there is a great mod out there that fixes many of the game's issues, as well as providing support for newer resolutions, appropriate HUD scaling, and much more besides. There'll be a link in the description for that one. Or if you're feeling particularly adventurous, why not give Project Snowblind a go?